Ladies and gentlemen, the topic for panel 4 is understanding and countering irregular adversaries. In this panel, our moderator, Major Kyle Atwell, co-director of the Irregular Warfare Initiative, will guide a discussion related to the question, what is irregular warfare and how can SOF conduct and prevent against IW in the future? Major Atwell is a Special Forces officer and Princeton graduate who now teaches in the Department of Social Sciences at West Point. Major Atwell, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon to those on the East Coast, good morning, evening, or good night to those dialing in from time zones around the world. Welcome to panel 4 of the JSOU Future of SOF Forum. The overall forum is titled Fourth Age of SOF, Use and Utility of Special Operations in a New Age. It consists of 8 panels over 2 days covering a range of important topics. For panel 4, this panel, JSOU asked the Irregular Warfare Initiative, for which I am chair and also a podcast host for the Irregular Warfare podcast, to build and moderate a panel on the topic of SOF's role in irregular warfare. We're very fortunate to have pulled together an exceptionally talented panel of scholars and practitioners to discuss this topic. Their full bios can be found at the events registration page on the JSOU website. I'll provide a very brief introduction though. Lieutenant Colonel Katie Crombe is an Army strategist currently serving as U.S. Special Operations Command Central as Director of Strategy and Plans. Dr. Seth Jones is Senior Vice President, among other positions, at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and author of the recent book, Three Dangerous Men, Russia, China, Iran, and the Rise of Irregular Warfare. Dr. Jake Shapiro is a professor of politics at Princeton University, and also co-author of the book, Small Wars, Big Data, The Information Revolution in Modern Conflicts. And our fourth panelist is Lieutenant General Ken Tovo, who retired from a career in the United States Special Forces, where he held many key positions, to include as commander of U.S. Army Special Operations Command. 2 things stand out about this panel. First, 3 of the panelists have been guests on the Irregular Warfare podcast, and I won't hide it, this is nothing more than a shameless plug to encourage those listening to check out the Irregular Warfare podcast, which you can find on Apple Podcasts and many other platforms. Second, they're all leading experts in irregular warfare. Seth and Jake as researchers, and Lieutenant Colonel Crombe and Lieutenant General Tovo as military practitioners. The mission of the Irregular Warfare Initiative, which I think is very complementary to that of the Joint Special Operations University, is to bridge the gap between scholars and practitioners to support the community of irregular warfare professionals. Today's panel is a great step toward meeting this mission. Without further ado, we can get to today's topic. The motivating question for today's panel is, what are the most pressing irregular warfare challenges over the next decade, and what role can SOF play to engage them? I'd like to start the conversation by discussing why this topic is important in the first place and to lay out some framing for the audience. I'll direct my first question to Dr. Seth Jones, whose recent book addresses irregular warfare directly, but then open it up to the other panelists. Dr. Jones, what is irregular warfare and how is it distinct from conventional warfare?
Thanks, Kyle, for doing this, and thanks to JSOU for organizing a fantastic conference. Let me just begin by defining, at least in my view, the components of irregular warfare, but we'll note that this definition is in many ways synonymous, at least with components of what others have used: gray zone activity, asymmetric conflict, political warfare, hybrid warfare. I won't get into various definitions, but I think there are similarities with how I'll outline this. So for me, irregular warfare refers to activities short of conventional and nuclear warfare that are designed to expand a country's influence and legitimacy, as well as weaken its adversaries. So it includes a number of important tools of statecraft that governments can use to shift the balance of power in their favor. They include things like information operations, including psychological operations, disinformation for some adversaries, misinformation, cyber operations, support to state and non-state partners, covert action, in some cases espionage, not the routine type of espionage, but some specific types, and then economic coercion. These tools some of them can also be used in conventional campaigns. They're simply a means, but in irregular warfare, a country designs and uses these tools to undermine its adversaries without engaging in set piece battles. So how does it differ from conventional warfare, or what some have called traditional or regular warfare. Well, conventional warfare includes the use of direct Army, Navy, Air Force, and other military capabilities to defeat an adversary's armed forces on a battlefield, to control territory, populations, and forces, or to annihilate an enemy's war-making capacity. So the realm we're talking about is below that threshold. And Kyle, one last comment I think is important is we talk about what irregular warfare means from a U.S. centric perspective, but I think it's critical to understand that how adversaries view it and the terms they use can be slightly different. So, for example, the Russians have used various components of active measures or maskirovka, denial and deception, and how they interpret and how they utilize irregular warfare is a little bit different, and the organizations they use are different. The Iranians have terms like soft war or jung-e-narm, and the Chinese have elements of the three warfares, for example. And it was the Chinese general Sun Tzu who remarked that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. I'll just add on definitions of irregular warfare that I think it is critical to understand how adversaries conceptualize it.
General Tovo, did you have a response to that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I don't disagree with anything that Seth said. I just, being a military practitioner in a doctrine-based army, at least, I always go back to what does the DoD think the definition is. And there's a couple of different ones out there, depending on how where you go in the source, but I'll refer to one of them. A violent struggle among state and non-state actors for legitimacy and influence over the relevant population. I like to conceptualize irregular warfare as, when you think about strategy, ends plus ways plus means. Conventional warfare and irregular warfare are seeking the same ends, right? We're seeking to exert influence over an adversary, or an adversary seeking to exert influence over us. It's just a function of what are the ways in which they've chosen it, what means do they apply to the problem. But we sometimes conceptualize irregular warfare as something that's merely just a lesser case or a subset, if you will, of conventional warfare. And I think that leads us astray. I think, in my mind, it's a different way to achieve essentially the same ends, which is to bend an adversary to one's will.
I have to admit, I've done about 50 episodes on the topic of irregular warfare for the Irregular Warfare podcast, and I'm not sure I could answer the question succinctly as it stands right now. What is irregular warfare? But I think it helps to contextualize what it looks like. Lieutenant Colonel Crombe, you're working in SOCCENT right now. You're dealing with these challenges in real time. Could you characterize the kind of the nature of or the character of the threats that you're seeing, and perhaps from the lens that Dr. Jones mentioned of how is it that our adversaries are leveraging and using irregular warfare?
Sure. Thanks, Kyle. Yeah, one thing just to piggyback on both the previous comments is what we see and what I think Russia and China, our primary adversaries, see, and then obviously Iran as well, is that, IW is largely a human endeavor. It requires a deep understanding of people and populations. And I know we kind of talk about that tongue in cheek, and we can say we've spent the better part of 20 years, coming in and out of that relative to COIN. But understanding people and populations is much different when it comes to actually enacting irregular warfare. So if you look at what Iran is doing just across the Middle East right now, they get in very, very deep with their proxies and then begin to make familial connections with the tribes and understand the populations, so that not only are they embedded militarily, but they're embedded in all aspects of society. So not only are they understanding it from an academic perspective, they're understanding it from a daily life perspective, the way that they understand wives, children, tribal elements. So when we, seek to build a new strategy for what we're going to do as we kind of get out of the named operations in the Middle East, how can we ensure that Iran doesn't hold so much influence over Lebanon per se, or Iraq, which is, a day-to-day struggle for us? We believe we need to get into the villages again, get really into the tribal dynamics in Iraq, especially Western Iraq, and start to understand where Iran has enacted this influence over the last 20 years. So while we've been fighting ISIS, since 2014, Iran has slowly but surely been making inroads that many of the intersections and geographic intersections, within Western Iraq, and beginning to build influence that way. And until we truly understand what leverage they may hold when it comes to smuggling, across the ground line of communication, or even the type of, office they hold on a school board or within the local government, we're not going to be able to push back against those. So it's much deeper than understanding for understanding's sake. It's understanding to begin to exploit that and leverage that in the future.
We're going to get into the capabilities needed to facilitate this understanding and what we need to operationalize this. But before we do that, Dr. Shapiro, you have 2 exceptional books looking at both terrorism and insurgency. You're one of the leading experts on these forms of warfare. And Colonel Crombe discussed kind of our operations of the last 20 years. How do you see the future of irregular warfare challenges compared to what we faced over the last 20 years? Is there a lot of difference? Is there a lot of similarity? And how relevant is this in the context of other challenges we might face?
So I think something that Colonel Crombe just raised, which is really important to keep in mind, is that one of the lessons of the last 20 years is that effectively operating against irregular adversaries requires a deep level of specific knowledge and specific cultural understanding and long-term investments in specific places. A key challenge for the community is going to be figuring out what are the places that we should make those investments when it is not as blindingly obvious as it has been for the last 20 years. When we're looking across the world and trying to anticipate where's the next threat coming from, where's the next place that might look like, for example, Ukraine does, that's a high-risk decision because Colonel Crombe is exactly right. The investments to succeed require time and energy and a lot of people. And we don't have the capacity to cover the world. And so there's going to have to be some significant bets made in terms of where to focus if we want to apply some of the art and approaches that have been learned over the last 20 years. I think that's just a fundamental challenge for the community.
I'd like to shift in a second to more specific discussion on how SOF can engage with these threats, where we allocate our resources. But one more kind of framing question before we go into it. General Tovo, in addition to your experience as at SOCIR, SOCCEN, and USASOC, you're also heavily involved in the peacekeeping mission in Bosnia and refugee operations in northern Iraq before serving as Deputy Commander of US Southern Command. What common threads related to irregular warfare, if any, do you find throughout those kind of widely diverse experiences that you had?
Yeah, I think that the thread of continuity is that irregular warfare is about asymmetric approaches. Right? And it's generally a form chosen by those with fewer means, in a weaker position of power, perhaps to the adversary or the environment that they're trying to impose their will on. Or one in which, and sometimes this is the U.S. choice, it's one in which we choose based on the level of perceived importance strategically of a problem, that we choose to use an irregular means because of the lower resource cost and some other benefits of choosing irregular means. I mean, for example, invasion of northern Iraq of Iraq in 2003. Our primary course of action initially was we're going to put a division up in the north. Politically, that was not acceptable to one of our allies. And in the end, we used a special forces group to leverage Peshmerga to create indigenous mass to accomplish the same effect that we wanted to do with conventional forces. So it was a lower resource investment, and it was really the only politically acceptable approach to creating a second front, if you will, for the invasion of Iraq and occupy the Iraqi army elements that were arrayed up there. So I think that the threat of continuity of irregular warfare, in my experience, has been the idea that it's generally an asymmetric approach, often by either somebody who doesn't have the means to pursue a more direct and conventional approach, or when somebody's self-limiting, when one of the parties is self-limiting based on their perception of how much it's worth in resource expenditure.
Dr. Shapiro, do you have a response to that?
Yeah, so I think one of the really interesting things that General Tovo's point raised is that political acceptability, it comes in many flavors, and one is the kind of means and the willingness to invest. Another is the risk that comes with different mechanisms or the timing. So if we think about the conflict in Ukraine, one way to think about that is the preparation for conflict with Russia over influence in the Ukraine had to be timed such that the two countries were never engaged at the same time. And so that was a kind of irregular engagement by us prior to there actually being active hostilities. And as hostilities are ongoing, there may be things going on in neighboring countries, but you want to be out of that particular place because the risk of direct engagement is just too high. That's a different way of thinking about irregular warfare than necessarily the engagement in the same time and place. But as we're seeing there, the investments made in training and equipping over the last 5 or 6 years are paying massive dividends in terms of defense against the threat that we cannot, for many good reasons, engage with directly.
Yeah, I sometimes wonder if it's not just something you use asymmetrically as an economy of force, but if sometimes it's actually the most effective option, even if there was a more resource intensive kind of approach. But with that, Dr. Jones, did you have a response? And then after that, Colonel Crombe?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, I think it's important to understand that, particularly the situation that where we sit with great power competition. I think there are a lot of strong kind of structural rationales for why states, including the U.S., will use and have used in the past irregular warfare, particularly when dealing with each other. And there are at least two right now, probably three. First is that the U.S., at least at the moment, remains the world's dominant conventional and nuclear power. So its defense budget as of 2022 is larger than the defense budgets of the next roughly 11 countries in the world combined. I mean, it's a major power to take on in the conventional realm. Second, the costs of conventional war are staggering with other great powers, so with the Chinese and Russians in particular. And a big part of that is the reality that all have nuclear weapons. So it would be very hard, if not impossible, to contain a conventional war to the conventional realm without escalating up to the nuclear realm. And then third, I think as we saw, I was involved in much of the last 20 years in Afghanistan with Generals Reeder and Miller and others. And I mean, the U.S. Has struggled at various times in wars like that. We struggled against the Taliban over that 20-year period. So you pull all those things together, and I think much like the Cold War for the last 20 years, we never saw the Soviet Union and the United States directly engage each other in conventional warfare because the costs and risks were too high of escalation to the nuclear realm. And I think what it means is that there are lots of avenues to weaken your adversary then through irregular means, through the ways that we've all described. But I think that's why this form of warfare is incredibly important, particularly in the area of great power competition, because nuclear weapons, I think, provide a major constraint on countries' willingness to fight each other at the conventional level.
Yeah, so all three panelists have just discussed, something that I think is incredibly important is that's the aspect of time. So if populations are the key terrain in irregular warfare, I believe that patience is actually the key skill set. And if you look at some of the success stories for irregular warfare when it comes to the U.S. conducting it over the past decade, it really has been, places like Colombia and now the Ukraine. And this is because, we were largely focused on Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. And policymakers, our own population, since they were focused on that, the Green Berets doing their day-to-day job in the Ukraine and Colombia were allowed to do just that, their day-to-day job. And in doing that, they had the patience over the decade to really make that force better. And I think until we kind of make policymakers understand the importance of patience when waiting for irregular warfare successes to come to fruition, we're going to continue to struggle with that. And if people look at what's going on with Ukraine today, like Dr. Shapiro said, it's not not about what we're doing right now. You know, of course, we can continue to pump weapons and training into that, but it's again the 10th group soldiers that have been there for the last decade, making Ukraine great and building a resistance movement within the country, and then tangentially building resilience within the population. That's what's working. So back to patience is kind of a key tenet of that.
Yeah, I'll just pile on that last one if I could. When we were in Iraq during the counterinsurgency years, working with primarily our ISOF counterparts and some others, we used to call it the 3 Ps: patience, persistence, and presence. And all of those, depending on where they are, require some level of strategic commitment and to some extent some strategic risk taking. We've had a lot of conversations since 2014 about how much commitment to the Ukraine, to the training effort there, army, et cetera. But I think it does require some strategic commitment. And so I always like to think of it as the 3 Ps. I would just, the other thing I'd like to do is emphasize Dr. Jones's point. The history of great power competition, even before the nuclear age, was one that great power conflict is frankly very expensive, resource intensive, and hard to control. Our UK allies won 2 great power wars of great power competition in World War I and World War II, and yet they came out of it without their empire. So even the winners lose in great power competition. And so I think anybody who's studied history will do everything they can as a great power strategist to find ways to both avoid it, yet still achieve national objectives under the threshold of conventional conflict, which is why I think it really is going to be the hallmark of future great power competition.
It's striking to me, Kyle, and colleagues, as we talk about this, if we go back to your motivating question, Kyle, like what are the challenges for the community? One that comes up really strongly in this conversation is going to be winning the argument for these long-term ongoing investments in relationship building and capacity building with partners that don't have an obvious or uncertain payoff and can't be kind of quantified in the way you can say, if we purchase this weapon system or that weapon system, we can do better in this extended deterrence scenario or that one. It's like in some ways a harder argument. And so I think that investment in storytelling and narrative by the community is going to be a real challenge in order to make sure we maintain these capacities and get the benefits of those long run engagements.
Seth, do you have a response to that?
Yeah, just to build on it, the other challenge, to be frank and to be blunt about it, is also to prepare for engagements that involve irregular warfare. So it is the shiny object right now, and it has been for the last few years as the Trump administration's NDS shifted the U.S. focus to competition with state adversaries. The shiny object was to conduct war games and scenarios and O-plans of major conventional war between the Chinese and the U.S. and their allies and partners over Taiwan or in the South China Sea. Same thing with the Russians in areas like the Baltics. I think the reality is there has been a very slow, and that's the way a number of the services would prefer that we war game. That's where a lot of the acquisition community wants to push some big programs for those kinds of wars. But I think the reality is that we need to be also focusing on, and this is not an either or, but also be focusing on the irregular aspects of competition. What if the Chinese were to conduct irregular activity to try to take Taiwan, much like they took islands in the South China Sea virtually overnight with dredgers? What if it was a subversive sabotage operation? Then we'd be talking really about an irregular response, or building the capabilities of the Taiwanese to fight the Chinese through irregular operations. It's also helpful for deterrence. So I think that part of the challenge is convincing the rest of the Department of Defense and the military that they need to take this aspect seriously, because there's going to be a lot of initiative and money directed at large conventional war and programs.
Dr. Jones, right to you or anybody else who has a response to this. Kind of one of the anecdotes that come out of the Irregular Warfare podcast is a story of somebody trying to explain that we're going to engage with irregular warfare challenges moving forward, and the response being, "Oh no, we're done with Iraq and Afghanistan right now. Like that was irregular warfare." Do you feel like the United States is prepared for these types of challenges? Does it need to do more to get prepared for these types of challenges, or are we kind of in a good place right now? I'll go ahead and direct it at Seth because you gave the last comment, but open it up to anybody else who has a follow-on.
Yeah, I think part of the answer depends on who the we is. I think there are at least two challenges more broadly. One is, it's interesting, the term warfare. When I spoke to folks across the interagency, there's a lot of nervousness about using the term warfare. They want to talk about gray zone activity. They don't want to talk about this in the warfare sense. I think that the challenge there is that this is the way our adversaries think about this subject. Is the term that they use. The Chinese use the term three warfares. The Iranians use the same term warfare, the soft warfare. And the reality is that this is warfare that's kind of less in the Clausewitzian sense and more in the Sun Tzu, trying to achieve your objectives without fighting, at least fighting conventionally. So that's one challenge that I don't think the U.S. more broadly is there yet. The second is the one I described earlier. Even within the U.S. military and the Department of Defense, I still think there's a lot of money and focus that continues to be on the conventional side. And again, this is not an either or. I think that in order to get engaged at the irregular level, that we need to deter adversaries, and there is an important component of building conventional capabilities to deter them. And then if we have to fight them through conventional level. But I think the biggest challenge, very briefly, is and this is in particular for the Chinese, a real lack of understanding of the Chinese right now. And I'm not just talking about language training. I'm just talking about big things like reading, translation of material, understanding what motivates the Chinese. During the Cold War, when we were really at our best, we had a U.S. information agency. We had an active measures working group across the interagency. We had a foreign broadcast information service that was translating massive amounts of Soviet, Czechoslovak, Polish, East German material, radio, newspapers, journals, television stations. We've got nothing, or almost nothing, when it comes to the Chinese. Their largest circulating newspaper right now is a compilation of foreign news, including English news, translated into Chinese. And I think the biggest issue, a big issue that we still have to work through, is understanding what our adversaries are thinking and how they are preparing along these lines. So I think for those reasons, we're not quite there yet.
So I'd like to shift direction a little bit. We framed the conversation, framed the character of the threat, and explained how prominent it might be in the future. Let's take a look at how SOF can engage with these irregular warfare challenges moving forward. The first question I'd like to direct to Lieutenant General Tovo, but then of course open it up to the rest of the panel. General Tovo, you have been on the front lines of SOF employment around the world for over 30 years. How does Russia's war in Ukraine impact our understanding of warfare and SOF's role in warfare moving forward?
Well, I think for me at least, Katie kind of hit a little bit of this. I think it just validates the fact that our approach to helping partners can make a difference. It can't always make a difference because you have to have the basic willingness on the part of a partner to take on what their own problems, if you will, to have the will to fight, to have the will to learn, to have the will to train. But I think it really validates our partner approach. I mean, the Ukrainians fighting today are a different military than they were back in 2014. a big part of that is a soft approach, but it's not just a soft approach. I mean, helping partners, the old concept of FID or foreign internal defense is a joint force task, not just a soft task. I think the particular focus that SOF ought to really zoom in on, and I think we did a lot of this in getting the Ukrainians ready, is this concept of creating a resistance concept, mobilizing more than just the military, the idea of mobilizing society. And so I think what you're seeing now is a lot of that come out to play, particularly as Ukrainian SOF demonstrate on the battlefield their ability to both act as a quote guerrilla force, but also that they're leveraging their own population, it seems. If you believe what you see on Instagram and elsewhere on the internet, that they're helping their own population resist the Russian invasion. So I think in many ways it validates that one of the primary roles for SOF going forward in irregular warfare is a partner-focused approach to solving complex problems.
Yeah, that's interesting. Some might see a conventional sort of traditional invasion with conventional armored forces into Ukraine as a signal that irregular warfare is dead. But I think there's a good point here that one of the key stories from the US side is the kind of partner warfare, working by, with, and through partners, training and equipping in the years before that kind of set conditions for a successful kind of defense of Ukraine. Dr. Jones, did you have a follow-up on General Tovo's comments?
Yeah, I completely agree with General Tovo, and I would push back very strongly against any kind of analysis or conclusion that the war in Ukraine shows, at least entirely, the importance of conventional warfare. Because I think when you look at the U.S. policy response, I mean, there has been a clear reluctance, not just among the U.S., but among other NATO allies, to engage the Russians directly in conventional warfare. And the president has said this for fear of escalation to nuclear war. And so the way to push back against the Russians has been primarily to operate by, with, and through Ukrainian partners. Now, there were all the efforts that led up to the Russian invasion in 2022, and then everything since, providing them weapon systems, training, intelligence, money, and other types of support. This is a classic example, I think, of where we saw the last 2 decades of the Cold War go, where we did not fight the Soviets in the Fulda Gap, which is where we had prepared to do that if it led to that on the inter-German border, but we fought them through state and non-state partners and proxies in Latin America and Africa and Asia and other locations around the world. It's a textbook example, I think, of why we need to continue ramp up, frankly, efforts to provide similar types of assistance elsewhere, including in Taiwan. And it's not just to help allies and partners fight some of our adversaries, but also to deter. One of the things that would be quite useful is building capabilities, and we'll get to the issue of integrate deterrence. But when we talk about the subject of deterrence by punishment, where you're increasing the costs and risks of an adversary conducting a war, that if building an ability for that country, so let's take Taiwan, to resist a Chinese invasion, in part because it becomes too costly. The Chinese can't do it because the cost of occupying a population that rises up against invading Chinese forces, the way we've seen the Ukrainians do that, that has the potential to have enormous costs. So there can be a deterrent element to it, in addition to helping a partner fight a major adversary. So I think this is a textbook example of Ukraine on why this subject is so important. In a sense, we are helping Ukraine fight one of our major adversaries.
I'm going to pass it to Jake, who I know has a response, but I'd also like to potentially tee up as one potential thing to answer. The role of information and disinformation in the conflict has been very difficult for many to process what is truth and what is false from the Russian side and from the Ukrainian side. In addition to whatever you're going to respond, if you have any insights on the role of information and disinformation in the Ukrainian conflict, that could be interesting for the audience.
Absolutely. And I think the point Seth raised, I think, was a great one. And it made me think of the centrality of information in that deterrence calculus, because it's not just that think about how do we engage in ways the Ukrainians did, or the Iraqis did, or the Afghans did, because there's no long tradition of conflict with mainland China. This is a foreign imposed thing that's only been there for 70 years. It's not part of a long tradition. You can easily imagine that decision-making process spinning in a way that the potential for a long-run insurgency is discounted, even if the training has been provided. And that's where I think some aspect of information becomes critical about convincing aggressors, not just of that the training has been provided and equipment, but that the society will respond in a way that is defensive and not say, you know what, it's not worth it. That seems really too awful for us to manage.
I'll just jump in there, Kyle, with a couple of things. Just to get back to the points kind of that General Tovo started and Dr. Jones followed up with partnerships. I think in addition to allies and partners, when we're thinking of, SOF's role, we don't want to forget about from a military perspective, we have traditional, senior defense officials and attachés and things like that. But what's usually core to these teams are the special operations liaison officers, the SOLOs, that build real inroads with the FBI, the agency, the State Department, and get to know what each other are training the host nation on. And it's these relationships that I can guarantee that really helped when the Ukrainian issue came up, a few months ago or over the course of 5 years, but really came to fruition a few months ago. And it's not only within the embassy, but it's the embassy to embassy relationships that are so, the U.S. country team getting to know each other and, what they can do to make the Ukraine better and more resilient and have a better resistance force. But they're also talking to other embassies who are doing the same thing. So that when we pile on as a cabinet or, big NATO, we have these inroads, and SOF does an incredible job of this. And that's why, when we start to pull out of places like the Middle East, because we're pulling out of named operations, leaving behind a small posture, especially of special operations forces that can kind of not only talk the partner and ally talk, but also talk the country team, state agency talk, is absolutely critical as kind of a stay behind to continue that golden thread. Just to get to the information ops kind of piece in the question that you talked about, Kyle. Information obviously critical. It's key terrain as well, with the populations. And I think that one thing that we're seeing with Ukraine and the population itself being so resilient is not only from a cognitive resilience, but also kind of physical and the financial hardening that we do as country teams when we get over there. So something that some colleagues and I have written a lot about is, the essence of what SOF does in these countries. It's not just your classic information operations. It's also getting these people to understand that they are being exploited from a predatory standpoint, so that they understand when there's disinformation and misinformation coming across the airways, that they second guess it, that they go to another website, that they turn and just highlighting those things so that the attribution is different.
It's funny you mentioned the liaison officers, because I'm pretty sure it's every brand new SF captain's nightmare to be assigned as a liaison officer somewhere when they could go to a team. But you quickly realize indeed that you can have sometimes a bigger impact as liaison officer than even as a commander or a team leader. But I'll pass it to General Tovo for a reaction to those comments.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point. We have almost let the idea that information operations is important roll off our tongues to the point where we don't even think about it. But in the end, my perspective is that warfare, conventional warfare, irregular warfare, is in essence a cognitive struggle, right? One opponent trying to convince the other that they are defeated and that they should bend to the adversary's will. And in conventional warfare, we do that by destroying the adversary's ability to defend himself, and then often imposing our will by occupying a nation. I would say, and even then, if we haven't convinced the population that they are defeated, a cognitive act, they can do a response and fight a guerrilla warfare against the occupier. So when we get to the idea of information operations, part of this is the ability to actually communicate to both our own target audience, our own population, the will to sustain a fight, but also to speak directly to an adversary's population. And I think that what's new in the digital age to some extent, although we've always tried to speak to our adversary's population, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, et cetera, but it's much easier now to reach in to a nation and speak directly to the adversary's population. And that's for both, applies both to us and our opponents. I think we've seen ample cases where our adversaries are trying to reach into American society and undercut will, sow confusion, et cetera. But I think that's why we've got to remember, war is in the end, war is a cognitive activity, and information is a means to influence our adversary's thought process.
Just to build on General Tovo's comment, he mentioned Radio Free Europe. There's an interesting historical analogy. I've been reading a number of translated, I read a little bit of Russian, but not real well, translated Russian myths right now of how and why the Russians or the Soviets lost the Cold War. And there are a number of very influential journal articles, military journal articles that argue that they lost not because they lost on the battlefield, but they lost what was essentially information war in the Soviet Union, but also in the Warsaw Pact in Eastern Europe. And if you go back to the steps that the U.S. took, it was broad interagency. It wasn't just special operations forces. It was also CIA. It was public diplomacy. So it was State Department. But it was the Radio Free Europe broadcasts into those countries. The CIA ran a very successful covert action program called QR Helpful to provide essentially an information campaign and capabilities to Solidarity in Poland. And there are some parallels with how we should be thinking about that today. If we look at the way the Russians have attempted to stifle freedom of speech in Russia right now, the last real Russian opposition newspaper closed this week. So we've seen the Russians sort of contract the information flows going to their own population about the serious problems they're having in Ukraine. That does open up opportunities for us to ensure that there are encryption capabilities so that people can get information that's been blocked by the Russian government from inside Russia, or VPNs, so they have access to technologies. They can get information outside of what's been blocked, and that goes to this broader concept, I think, that General Tovo highlighted, which is, at the end of the day, I think when we look at the competition the U.S. is in right now with the Russians, the Chinese, and even the Iranians, it is to a great extent a competition of ideologies and political
of ideas, and not that our problem was we were wrong about the best way to organize production, wildly so, and couldn't keep up, is unbelievable. It would be like the US looking at it would be a 10,000 times more dramatic version of the US looking at Afghanistan and what happened there and saying, oh, the problem was we didn't have enough MRAP, like crazy. And that level of self-delusion, I think, is something that I don't know. It was completely striking to me and somewhat just blew my mind. So I just had to point that out.
I'd just like to jump on that. And the idea, I think we talked earlier about the fact that we have to figure out how to understand how our opponents, adversaries, competitors, whatever we want to call them, how they see the world and how they think at a level of understanding that isn't about mirror imaging. We have our view of the world. I mean, we've watched over the course, literally since the Soviet Union collapse, of a series of what they call color revolutions, and they see the Soviets, and now the Russians, have seen the hand of the U.S. intelligence agencies behind every one of those societal upheavals, whether it was the Ukraine revolution, or they saw those as U.S. intelligence community manipulation of a society instead of the natural movement of a people wanting to change the nature of how their society is organized. But we need to understand that about how our adversary looks at the world. And similarly, I mean, we're fairly comfortable. There's still enough of us around from who lived in the Cold War days, or at least read books, who kind of understand to some extent the Russian psyche, because it hasn't really changed much from the Tsars to the Soviets to today. There are some threads of continuity. We lack that same level of understanding about the Chinese view of the world. And that is, until we understand how our adversaries see the world, we will not be able to create coherent strategies to deal with it.
Point well taken, General Tovo. And I will say Dr. Jones's book does an excellent job of addressing not what the U.S. view is of irregular warfare, but specifically what Iran, Russia, and China's views are in a very kind of helpful way based on what you said. I'd like to pivot directions a little bit and direct this first question at you, Dr. Jones. Where should SOF be focusing operationally? And also, where should it not be focusing? What are areas that are not the right application of SOF? And there's a lot of things we could discuss. Geographic focus, which was touched on before. Do we focus on the periphery, or do we focus on the immediate areas around adversaries? Integration across the joint interagency, intergovernmental, multinational space, kinetic versus population-centric, authorities and mission sets. Where do you think SOF should and should not be focusing operationally?
It's a good question. My general sense is that if you look at, say, the Belt and Road Initiative, and actually even the Russians' use of private military companies, including the Wagner Group, and anywhere where we see the Wagner Group or any of the PMCs deployed, there usually is some combination of GRU or SVR deployed there as well. They're global in nature. We see a heavy emphasis on Russian activity in Africa. Key parts of Belt and Road Initiative are in Africa. They're across Asia. We've seen elements in Latin America as well. So I think it would be a mistake, not just for conventional, but also for special operations forces to be focusing solely on the Indo-Pacific, because I think when you look at where these countries are expanding, the Chinese expanding ports in Djibouti, building Atlantic-based ports in Africa. The Chinese have been trying to push into UAE as well. This is a global competition, and so I think there's a global component to that. I don't think, at least where it comes to a comparative advantage, when it comes to preparing for deterring for conventional or even nuclear war. I mean, the role of SOF is going to be limited there. The main focus will, I think, be in the Indo-Pacific for conventional war. It is, it's aircraft carriers and Virginia class and Columbia class nuclear submarines and others. There is a role for SOF in conventional and nuclear warfare, including the weapons of mass destruction response. But I think it's really to support conventional forces operating. Where I think the heavy advantages for SOF are competing with GRU and RGC Quds Force and a range of PLA subversive activities across the globe. I think to build resistance efforts in Eastern Europe, including in the Baltic states. We've seen it in Ukraine. Same thing across the Indo-Pacific. There's partly a deterrence role for that, but in case there's an invasion, there's a need to build capacity to resist. I think those are the areas really in unconventional warfare and in foreign internal defense, UW and FID. Those are key areas where I think SOF can continue to operate. And again, I will stress, I don't think this is a primarily Indo-Pacific or even just a EUCOM focus. It is interesting to go back to General Tovo's last point that if you look at the two now most popular movies in Chinese history that is watched by Chinese, they are both movies where the main adversary is the United States. And if we look at Wolf Warrior 2, the primary Chinese hero is a former special operator in Africa fighting essentially a U.S. former special operator, now a U.S. contractor. So it is irregular in nature. It's what the Chinese are showing their populations. And so I think we have to recognize that they consider this global competition as well, not just in the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, Dr. Jones, I think you hit the nail on the head when you were talking about just the global nature of, how SOF needs to stay focused. We can pivot to the Indo-Pacific all we want, and we all understand that that's important. But the Indo-Pacific geographically is not where a lot of these countries are going to continue to fight. I mean, China looks west, Russia looks west. The Middle East is looking east. But if we want to play with them, we have to play and compete where they are. And I think this kind of gets to where SOF should operationally focus is everywhere, and get down to kind of the core tenets of what SOF is. SOF truth number one, humans are more important than platforms. And just being brilliant in the basics of unconventional warfare, COIN, CT, MISO, and then building these partnerships with, again, allies and partners and in the interagency. And that's what's going to take us to the next level. And really, the most important part is being able to provide irregular options to our policymakers. This is where we become the shiny objects that they're looking for sometimes. And it's things like providing horizontal escalation options or de-escalation options. We don't want to fight Russia and the Ukraine. The president said this, the SecDef said that we don't want to escalate there. But if there's something that we have to push back upon, there's PMCs and there's Russian forces elsewhere in the globe that we have the option to pursue. So we need to be the ones that are coming up with these creative options to deliver to the policymakers in the future.
I just offer, Kyle, at this point that before we jump to the where should we be operationally focused, I think part of the challenge we have here is that from a strategic level, we need a framework. We need a strategic framework that defines what the operational focus and the tactics to employ might be. We went into the strategic competition with the Soviet Union with a strategic framework of containment. And that drove then what the operational focus was, where geographically things were important, where they weren't. And until we have that, I think we'll be musing, but not really planning and not really focused on getting after what competition looks like. Strategic competition is not a strategy. It describes an environment. And so we now need to say, given the environment of strategic competition of a global nature, as highlighted, against really multiple adversaries, certainly we can tier them, but this is no longer a bipolar world, it's a multipolar world. So it's going to look different than it did the last time we had to live this set of conditions. But we need to kind of actually do some thinking now and say, all right, what are some strategic options for Russia? Maybe it is containment of further Russian aggression. What are the options for China? But we need to kind of get a strategy before we jump to what pieces of geography on the map. Now, there are some continuities in geography, right? Just look at the sea lines of communication and the important trade focal points that are geographic in nature, the Strait of Hormuz, et cetera. Those can help guide us as far as what's geographically important. From a SOF perspective, as you look to the future, I would argue that we've got a pretty good mix of capabilities across SOCOM, and I wouldn't say that any of them will not be needed in the future. I think what we need to understand, though, is that it is likely, given the highly irregular nature of our problem sets going forward, that those forces that are optimized for population-centric approaches, aka irregular warfare, probably need to be resourced to some level in a more balanced manner than we do our direct action forces. That might be a starting point. But in the end, I think, SOF exists to solve hard problems and to create hard problems for our adversaries. And so we ought to start thinking, how and where will we be able to create hard problems for them in an asymmetric manner that might contribute to an operational campaign?
Kind of the root of the question, which are there some areas where SOF should double down on and some areas where SOF is maybe not the right answer? I think if you look at the past 20 years during the global war of terror era or the Iraq-Afghanistan era, the kind of public perception of SOF is it's a direct action force. The reality might have been a little bit different. But could you expand a little bit more on the specific capabilities that you think SOF should be investing in, and other areas where SOF should be cutting down resources in?
I think when we look at the enduring successes of the last 20 years, many of them come from kind of core capabilities, what I call the strategic value propositions. One is indigenous approach to warfare. I would contend, despite the fact that some people look at Iraq and Afghanistan and say working with partners doesn't work. I look at what we created with the ISOF and the fact that when everything else collapsed in Iraq, when ISIS came to town in 2013-ish, the only thing that held was ISOF. The only thing that prevented ISIS from occupying Baghdad was the fact that ISOF kept fighting. And that was a commitment over years of primarily US Green Berets training a partner in a holistic manner that achieved a capability that was sustainable by the partner. And I think that is a strategic value proposition that will endure into the future. I think our ability to conduct precision targeting, both kinetic and non-kinetic, and that spans a bunch of different tribes, if you will, across the SOCOM community, demonstrated a critical value. I mean, the network targeting of our adversaries made a difference. It was not sufficient, but it was a necessary condition to try and beat the insurgents. So I think that matters. And conversely, it's also a non-kinetic aspect. When we precisely target our adversary in the cognitive domain, we can make a difference at the operational and strategic level. And I think we provide value in the fact that we do have, through our partners, through our persistent presence on the ground, a contextual understanding that can feed into decision makers. I think those are going to be continuities going forward, and there's probably others as well. But I think until we have a framework and a strategy, I wouldn't throw any pieces or parts of the enterprise overboard and say we're not going to need this in the future. I do think we need to invest a little bit more in our information operations capabilities and bring it into the 21st century.
Right now, we're talking about the capabilities that SOF needs to engage in future irregular warfare context. I'd like to pass off to Lieutenant Colonel Crombe. We've discussed information operations, the importance of understanding adversaries, as well as working with partners. Based on your work at SOCCENT and then in your previous work at SOCOM, what are the capabilities that you're seeing the SOF community needs to focus on developing at this time?
Like General Tovo alluded to, there's a whole network of networks that goes on in the SOCOM enterprise when it comes to advanced technologies and machine learning, everything that they're developing kind of on the high end side. One thing that my current boss, Admiral Bradley, and I discuss a lot is really just about the necessity of education going forward. And I know that seems kind of elementary, no pun intended, but if we were to look at one skill set that everyone needed right now for the next 20 years and, what the national defense strategy will address when it comes to our, primary adversary, China, is we need to go to school on China. We need to educate ourselves on China. And like Dr. Jones talks about in a lot of his writing, it's not just about learning to learn, understanding to understand. It is about reading their text, true translations. It's about getting people that speak the language and can read it organically going forward, or we're never going to be able to create the strategy that General Tovo is talking about that we really need. Because there's, you develop a strategy always in the mirror image realm, and it's very difficult to understand what China is really pursuing. We can say what we find in different intel means and what we read in open source, but their strategy is 100 years, and it's putting people here that understand our way of life and can therefore, go back to China and begin running strategies to counter it. And until we're willing to make those sorts of investments and kind of take risk, sometimes on the operational side, and this is in no way to say that we don't need high-end forces to do direct action and continue to be experts in that, but it's to maybe take a little bit of risk in the middle ground there and dump some resource into finding the right people that are willing to kind of learn these languages. And they might not be the height, weight, look of a typical ranger, but we employ them in SOCOM to help us understand. If you look at how the agency is made up, it's everyone from operators to purple hair, and kind of expanding our aperture to look like that. SOF, if you go back all the way to the OSS, they've always been at the forefront of being open-minded about accepting different people into their circle, right? They brought women in very early. They've brought different skill sets in cyber very early. And I think it's continuing to do that, but with a real focus on, what China is pursuing and getting us to understand that going forward.
Just to add to that, Kyle, if I can, and before I do, I just want to put an exclamation point on General Tovo's comment about all of this has to be under a strategic construct. I think that is absolutely critical. In fact, I think we're not quite there yet strategically in the U.S. of coming together and developing a strategy for how to deal with some of our adversaries in a multipolar world. But I think any use of SOF and other forces and obviously across the interagency really needs to be done as part of a broader strategic construct. But when it comes to capabilities, I would just say a couple of things which sort of lead me to some implications. First is we've already talked about, I think, that how we compete with adversaries under a strategic construct will likely be global, not confined to just Europe or the Indo-Pacific, and that it will likely be, as it was with the Soviet Union, much broader in geographic terrain. Second, that we see a lot of efforts by adversaries to try to hide, to develop capabilities, tactics, technologies. The Russians called it maskirovka, denial and deception in those areas, particularly in the second and third worlds. And then also we look at the U.S. force posture, at least at the moment, is declining in a range of these areas. It's certainly declined in Africa, probably likely to decline at least the conventional footprint in areas like the Middle East. It's relatively small in Latin America. So I think part of the kinds of capabilities for SOF operating in these areas is to help us with this, overcome this challenge of hiding and finding. So, the unmanned aerial vehicles, the underwater as well, counter drone capabilities that we're seeing in the Middle East as adversaries like the IRGC Quds Force provides standoff capabilities, land attack cruise missiles, drones, Delta Wing drones to proxy forces in places like Yemen, capabilities also to counter drones, cyber, thinking about how do we integrate cyber, including potentially offensive cyber at the team level. So I think as we're talking about operating in these kinds of areas where adversaries are going to try to hide some of what they're doing, being able to find them, compete with them, across multiple domains, including the space and cyber, I think are important. So I think those do lead to some kinds of capabilities that will likely be necessary. But again, to come back to General Tovo's comment, under a broader strategic construct.
We are bumping up on time right now. We have about another 8 minutes. I'd like to shift to our final question, which is, and also provide closing comments for you, which is, what are the implications of this conversation for policymakers and soft practitioners? I'd like to start with General Tovo, but then we can also go around to everybody and continue the discussion over this topic.
I think from a policy perspective, we've written a lot about irregular warfare over the last decade. It's all great stuff. It all talks about, we got to maintain the lessons we learned and all that. I think we need to figure out how to operationalize that and execute it. That's part of it. Some of it is our policymakers are less familiar with the tools of irregular warfare, and they need to learn the tools of irregular warfare like they understand the tools of counterterrorism and to some regard conventional. I'd also add they also need to relearn deterrence in a nuclear age and operations in a nuclear age and deterrence theory. I think fundamentally, though, if I could wave a magic wand and make one thing change inside our policy world, it's this view of the security environment as binary. We believe that things are either at peace or at war. Our adversaries look at it as a continuum in which it's a constant struggle with crescendos of violence that may be irregular warfare aspects or maybe even conventional warfare aspects, but it's a continuum and a constant struggle. And we view it very differently. It's either peaceful, in which case it's a State Department lead, or it's warfare, in which case it's a DoD lead. And frankly, that is a stovepipe approach that doesn't lend itself well to all those things that exist in between peace and war, like Yemen and Lebanon and Syria and Iraq, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think we've got to figure out how to reorient our view of approach and our approach to the security environment and understand that our adversaries are in a constant struggle with us, and we need to be as well.
So I want to jump in here and just try to be a little provocative since it's the end of the conversation. General Tovo raised a really good point, which is we're in a continual struggle with adversaries. And as Dr. Jones pointed out earlier, part of that is over which system is going to be more effective in the long run for providing benefits to its populations. And in that struggle, we cannot afford the bias in our national investment towards military spending that has been in evidence the last 20 years. Right? If we think about the opportunity costs of the last 20 years of investment in Afghanistan and Iraq, that is destroying our competition in terms of preparing for an energy transition. That is revitalizing all the infrastructure in our highways and rails and oil transportation infrastructure across the country. That's preparing for a more effective electricity grid. So the opportunity costs are non-zero. And one of the amazing things about this community is how cost efficient it has proven in the last 20 years compared to other parts of the military. And so when we think about winning that competition, it seems to me that part of what this community can contribute is providing a story that gives policymakers a way to manage the costs of our military investments and to think about telling stories and narratives and making arguments about competition and great power competition in particular that allow more efficient, lower cost opportunities and capabilities to win out over the communities that provide massive benefits, frankly, to the legislative branch in terms of spending. Every year we have defense budgets that come back larger than what the Pentagon asks for. And that is somewhat crazy. And so when you think in that macro frame, it just seems to me there's a real opportunity for the community of irregular warfare professionals to say, look, there are ways to accomplish our security goals in this environment of continuous competition that don't involve that volume of spending. And here's how we've proven it over the last 20 years.
It seems like sometimes there is competition over approaches to challenges between the kind of soft community and then the conventional community. And I wonder, Dr. Jones, based on your experience in DC, based on your research and your experience supporting the soft community, do you find that this competition is a real thing? And does soft do a good job of communicating the options that it provides to policymakers in DC?
Well, I think the soft community does do a good job in many ways of communicating what it does. I still find at senior levels of the U.S. government that there continues to be a misnomer that soft essentially is equivalent to direct action, and I think there needs to be a continual, day in and day out education that soft does not equal just direct action, because for the last 20 years or so, there was some successful direct action in the Middle East, in South Asia, and in other areas of the globe against Islamic State, against Al Qaeda, and against other organizations. But that there is a significant expertise in unconventional warfare, foreign internal defense, that are building the capacity of partners and allies. And I think with not just the current U.S. administration, but most anyone likely to come, you can't compete with countries, particularly like China, without leveraging your partners and allies. I mean, the Chinese have a population of 1.4 billion and a fairly large and growing economy. And so it means that you need to rely on not just your strongest allies and partners, the Australians, South Koreans, the Japanese and Indians, including some within the Quad, but also a number of other countries in the Indo-Pacific, obviously plenty within the NATO alliance. And I think in that sense, it means building capabilities. These are training, advising, assisting, the stuff we've been talking about. These are, and I still get these conversations, find myself in these conversations about, oh, well, soft community is mostly about direct action, and it's mostly about CT. We don't do that anymore. So I think that education and re-education will need to continue for the foreseeable future, because I think it's just as pervasive in this administration as it will probably be in the next one.
Colonel Crombe, we're down to 1 minute. I hate to cut you short, but do you have, in the last 30 seconds, any closing comments on implications for policymakers and practitioners from this conversation?
Yeah, no pressure at all. Just to piggyback on the previous three comments. I mean, I would say, our narrative really needs to be that soft offers an outsized return on investment as long as you're patient. It's more like a Roth IRA than a day trading stock. And I think that once, policymakers understand that, we can really be more effective with the tools that we have at our hands. And then the last thing I would say just about deterrence theory in general, and everyone kind of wrapping their head around this as the NDS is released. We think of deterrence obviously by denial and punishment. And then there's the pillars right now of strategic nuclear and then conventional. I think if we add an irregular deterrence pillar to that overall, then we are much more apt to do things like war game, as Dr. Jones specified, and put investment and education into deterring against irregular warfare, through irregular deterrence. And until we outline or define that as a separate thing, not just in support of conventional and strategic, but as a separate thing in general, I think that we'll struggle to get the support that we need.
Outstanding. Well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for sharing their insights today. This has been a great conversation. Thank you to JSOU for providing this platform for the important conversation. And also importantly, thank you to our audience for taking the time to engage with this topic. The recording of this audio will be available through both the JSOU and Irregular Warfare Initiative platforms. This concludes today's conversation on irregular warfare.
Kyle, thanks to you and your panelists for an excellent discussion. It was a great way to wrap up today's first day of the panel.